Welcome to the latest episode of the Real World Nutrition Podcast. This is episode 192. What even is a healthy food? Cutting through the confusion. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Real World Nutrition Podcast. I'm Shelley Rael, registered dietitian nutritionist, and today's episode is about what is a deceptively simple question. What even is a healthy food? What defines a healthy food? This is something I hear all the time. Clients want to eat healthier or ask if a particular food is healthy. But honestly, in reality, that question is a lot trickier than it sounds. It's not as straightforward as many people might think. Some things may be obviously healthy, like a banana or an apple. Some things may be obviously not so healthy, like Coca-Cola, or any sugar-sweetened beverage, I should say, not picking on Coke. So I want to get to some of these things that make it a more nuanced thing, that we can have those things that seem obviously healthy or not healthy, but what makes something or puts something in that category. Now, I just want to mention here at the top, if you want to read more about this topic, I have a blog that I published earlier this week. I have the link in the show notes that goes along with this episode, and I'll include the references, the reference to that, I should say, in the show notes, as I think I just said. But on that blog post, I also list a few references that I'll make a note of as I'm going through here. Okay, so let's talk about the definitions of healthy. So that word healthy is loaded because what is healthy for one person might be off limits for another. So here's an example. People might think brown rice is healthy. Yeah, when would it not be? But for someone with kidney disease, they might need to avoid it for certain reasons. Or fruit. Some people are actually told to avoid fruit because it's loaded with sugar. I never tell people that. Even people with diabetes, we have ways to integrate it. There are a lot of people who don't think certain fruits are considered healthy because it's packed with sugar, but really it's packed with nutrients, and that's naturally occurring sugar. That's not the sugar people are getting too much of anyway. But also what gets confusing is because people often use this term healthy as a shortcut for good, nutritious, low calorie, low fat, or even just that it's not junk food. I even have people think that if they buy food at a very specific store with a very specific name, that it is automatically healthier when there is plenty of food in that store that is not, that would be categorized as healthy. So these are all different things: healthy, good, nutritious, low calorie, low fat, or even just not junk food. You may have your definition. You may think that some of these definitions are silly, or no, that's not what healthy means. Trust me, I've encountered that a lot. And I've even had people come up to me and ask me, as they saw me going from a pizza place near where I used to work, "Oh, is that place healthy?" And there's no easy way to answer that. So as a dietitian, when someone asks, "Is that healthy?" So when I had gotten that sandwich from the pizza place and that person asked, "Is that healthy?" I'm like, well, in the context of what? Yes, it was healthy because it was feeding me something I needed. I needed something to eat at that point, and it was a food that I liked. But is it healthy for whom? In what amount? How often? Was I going to get that sandwich every week or every day? How often was I doing it? Or was that sandwich healthy compared to what? The cannolis they sold? And when that person asked me if that food was healthy, she didn't even know what food I had. She just saw me coming from that restaurant with something and made an assumption. So let me back up a bit. Referring to the blog post I posted earlier this week, I want to talk about what the FDA says, or the Food and Drug Administration says. But actually there is an official definition for the term healthy, sort of. So for decades, this term healthy on food packaging was guided by criteria that was established in the 1990s. Now, as much as I think the 1990s was 10 or 20 years ago, we're in 2025. So the 90s was 35 years ago, 25 to 30 years ago. So keep that in mind. So these guidelines that were taken or established in the 90s was based on information from the 80s and some of the 90s. It primarily focused on individual nutrients, emphasizing limits on total fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, and sodium, while at the same time requiring minimum amounts of specific beneficial nutrients like vitamin A, vitamin C, calcium, iron, protein, and fiber. A food could only be labeled healthy on packaging if it met specific criteria of limits or minimums of these nutrients. So don't worry about all the different categories there of those vitamins and minerals and fiber and that sort of thing. Just get the big picture. However, as nutrition science has evolved and we understand things now, like the type of fat consumed is more significant than the total amount, and that dietary cholesterol has a lesser impact on our blood cholesterol than previously thought. So, most of us as dietitians, as health professionals, don't address dietary cholesterol the way it used to be addressed. So, with all of these updates and the evolution of nutrition science, it was time for an update on this definition of healthy by the FDA. And I'll tell you, some of us even felt this update was way overdue. And knowing how some of this stuff goes on behind the scenes, it does take years. So the original definition had that nutrient-centric approach. So let me give a little bit more detail on that, or overview. So to state this again, under the original guidelines, for a food to be labeled as healthy, it had to be low in total fat, low in saturated fat, low in cholesterol, and low in sodium, and provide at least 10% of the daily value for one or more of vitamin A, vitamin C, calcium, iron, protein, or fiber. Now, again, you don't need to know that, remember all these names, the fat, cholesterol, sodium, calcium, iron, etc. Let me explain what happened though. This approach led to what we called some paradoxical situations. So here's an instance. Sugar sweetened cereals, ready to eat cereals that were fortified with vitamins could be labeled as healthy, while some nutrient dense foods like nuts, seeds, and avocados were excluded due to their fat content. So those sugar sweetened cereals, low in fat, no cholesterol, low in sodium, and with all the fortification of cereals, provided at least 10% of the daily value for those nutrients. But nuts, seeds, and avocados, too high in total fat. So it was excluded right there. So it seems obvious to those of us who fully understand these nuances, those who are up to speed on the updates on food and nutrient recommendations. Yes, avocados are not an unhealthy food in general. But to the general public, this created confusion. It led to backlash in some situations because there was this idea that dietitians were suggesting that sugar sweetened cereals were somehow a health food. Sorry, Lucky Charms, I would never put you in the category as healthy. I would put it in the category of, if you like it, go ahead, moderation. That isn't what was being said, as no dietitian was recommending these sugar sweetened cereals as a healthy food. It could be part of an overall healthy diet. But at the same time, it did meet those guidelines for healthy based on that prior older definition. So with that, you know it was coming. Prior older definition means we have an updated definition focusing on emphasizing whole foods and dietary patterns. So recently, in December of 2024, it was revealed that there is now a new updated definition, which, as I said, was worked on behind the scene for years, and it's now available. The FDA's updated criteria shift the focus from individual nutrients to overall dietary patterns and food groups. So now, with the new definition of healthy, to qualify, a food must, one, contain a meaningful amount of a food from at least one of the recommended food groups. So that would be a meaningful amount of food from vegetables or fruit or grains, whole grains, or dairy or protein foods, and not exceed specific limits for certain nutrients, including saturated fat, sodium, and added sugars. Added sugars. So this update to the healthy definition align with the dietary guidelines for Americans, which advocate for a balanced intake of nutrient-dense foods and moderation of components that can contribute to chronic disease when consumed in excess. So moderation of components that contribute to chronic disease when consumed in excess. For example, sodium. We can still, of course, have sodium in our diet. We actually need it, but the excess amount. Excess added sugars can contribute to chronic disease risk. Excess saturated fat can contribute to chronic disease risk. And as I always say, remember, dietary guidelines for Americans are indeed guidelines. They're not rules. And a lot of times when I talk about the guidelines, most people have no idea what they even say. So if people would look at what it says, they may be surprised. I'll put a link in the show notes to a 4-page executive summary of the dietary guidelines for Americans and say, look at the last 2 pages. People might be surprised what is there. It's pretty straightforward and pretty easygoing. So with this new definition of what is healthy, qualifies as healthy, what foods now fall into this category? Well, nuts and seeds. A lot of us knew nuts and seeds are good for us, despite their fat content. They're rich in unsaturated fats. They have protein. They have fiber. They're really good for us. It's a common snack I recommend. As I mentioned, avocados. Avocados are high in monounsaturated fats and so many essential nutrients. So yes, avocados are healthy. Salmon and other fatty fish. They are excellent sources of omega-3 fatty acids. So even though they are high in fat, like a piece of salmon is more than 50% of the calories from salmon come from fat, but it's healthy fat. Olive oil, a staple of the Mediterranean diet, Mediterranean lifestyle, known for its heart health benefits and is 100% fat, can fall into that category of healthy because it's not high in saturated fat. It is not high in added sugars. It doesn't have any, doesn't have sodium. So that's now part of the category where a food or that's an oil that qualifies as healthy. And then, as I've mentioned numerous times, eggs. Eggs are a complete protein source, loaded with essential vitamins and minerals, including the yolk. That's where a lot of the vitamins and minerals are. And they now qualify as healthy because cholesterol is not something that we are even looking at anymore for most people. And they aren't high in saturated fat. So these new inclusions reflect that more nuanced understanding of how whole foods contribute to health beyond a single nutrient like fat. It focuses on the combination of nutrients overall. And to think that salmon or olive oil did not qualify as healthy food is silly. And of course, that's because the prior definition had flaws. And with that new definition, foods that no longer qualify based on that old definition, so those foods that met the criteria with the old definition are now excluded due to high levels of added sugars, saturated fats, or sodium. So as I mentioned, sugar-sweetened cereals, even if they're fortified, their high sugar content disqualifies them. Now, there is a threshold for that sugar content, so some that people might think are sugary cereals may still be below that threshold of added sugars. Sweetened yogurts, added sugars can outweigh the benefits of the probiotics and calcium. Now, not in general, yogurts that have added fruit, or I have some yogurts that I like that are banana cream pie flavored. They don't have a lot of added sugars. I'm talking about the sugars that were in some of those Go-Gurts or those Trix flavored yogurts and things like that. They had really high sugar content. And then white bread lacks the whole grain component and often contains added sugars. So this isn't that these foods have to be completely excluded. It just doesn't qualify as a healthy food based on the old criteria. So this shift in this new definition aims to prevent those misleading health claims on products that may not support our overall dietary health. But here's the thing, I want to emphasize that this real world nutrition doesn't live on a label. So this is where my real world nutrition definition comes in. A reminder, no single food makes or breaks your health. So instead of labeling in our own mind, in our own words, in our own attitudes, instead of labeling foods as, quote, healthy or unhealthy, it can be helpful in some cases, like setting guidelines for school meal programs or SNAP benefits. It's difficult to do that on an individual level. So as an individual, you can ask yourself better questions. Does this food nourish me? Does it satisfy me? How does it fit in the context of my day? How does it fit in the context of my week? Is this food enjoyable? And does it meet a physical or emotional need? So let's take something like a cupcake. On its own, is it healthy? Maybe not. However, as part of a birthday celebration with friends and family, it can absolutely be part of a healthy lifestyle. On the other hand, a kale smoothie could be packed with nutrients, but if you hate it, have to force yourself to drink it, and it leaves you hungry an hour later, that doesn't sound like wellness to me. It doesn't sound like healthy to me. And if you like kale smoothies, good for you. I can't stand it. People say, oh, put your spinach in your smoothie. You can't taste it. I believe you can. That's me. I don't enjoy that in my smoothie. I have other smoothies I like that are loaded with nutrition, not high in sugar. So keep in mind what fits into your needs. And just because something is healthy doesn't mean you have to like it and eat it. I do not like Brussels sprouts. As somebody over the age of 50, people still try to convince me, you'll try it this way, try it this way. At this age, I am okay with not committing to eventually like Brussels sprouts. I don't care how healthy they are. If I don't like them, that's okay. I find other things to make up for that, whatever nutrients might be missing by not ever having Brussels sprouts. Trust me, there's plenty of other places to get those nutrients. So let's shift the conversation here. Yes, we have this definition of healthy, or I should say, there is a definition of healthy foods and how it can be labeled as such. But I encourage you to move away from the idea that food is inherently good or bad, healthy or unhealthy. Instead, take a step back. Look at your eating patterns as a whole. You might eat chips with your sandwich. Cool. You also had some vegetables later. You drank water. You had a balanced dinner. That's the big picture. Restrictive thinking often leads to guilt, shame, and all or nothing patterns. And labeling food as bad often gives it power that it doesn't need to have. So yeah, looking at this idea, is that food healthy or not? Step back and let's just look at the big picture. I know I've said that, but look at the big picture. Next time you're tempted to ask, is this food healthy? Stop. Ask, what does my body need right now? What supports my energy? What supports my satisfaction? What supports my values? Remember, what's healthy for you today might shift over time, and that's normal. The new FDA guidelines are helpful for many, and making some choices, and for those, it's helpful for many, and making some choices, and for those who may not understand that sometimes foods, there are foods that shouldn't be eaten every day. I'm mixing myself up here in my notes. So what I'm trying to say is there's been times where I have encountered people who have said, well, I get fries and a Coke from this fast food restaurant every time I go by it, which is several times a week. And, well, for some people, it may seem obvious that's not a healthy choice, consistently doing that. Some people don't understand that those are not necessarily foods that should be eaten every day. So keep in mind, you make choices, but make choices as an informed consumer. So again, I want to reiterate, you may be very well up to speed that, having a Coke, a regular Coke and fries every single day is not the best for your overall health. But there are people out there who don't realize how much of an impact it has on their health. Trust me, I've been doing this for 25 years. I am continually surprised, as much as information as people have, misinformation people have, that there are some things that a lot of us consider basic information, basic knowledge. Not everybody has that. But that's my job to take care of that. Help them, not yours, okay? So just wanted to put that out there. So once again, I have the link in the show notes to my blog that has all those details about the definition from the FDA. I have a link in the show notes for the dietary guidelines for Americans if you're interested. Again, just doing the little 4-page executive summary. And in that blog, I do have links to the FDA's website that has the information about how these things and the implementation. So I wanted to say real quickly, with this new definition, the starting date or initiation date started in April of 25, late April of 2025, but food manufacturers have until February of 2028, I think it was, to catch up to this. So even though these rules are now in effect, there is a compliance date that is a few years out to give food manufacturers time to change packaging, update things, maybe change some of the content of their food. So it may take a few years for you to maybe see this as I'm talking about it today. All right, with that, if this episode was useful to you, resonated with you, you know somebody who might benefit from hearing this, I encourage you to share it with a friend, leave a review, send me a note saying, hey, that was great to hear that. All right. Thanks for listening this week. As always, I will be back in this feed next Friday and every Friday morning with another episode of Real World Nutrition. All right, everyone, take care and bye for now.